How's it going, everybody? It's Man Tomorrow here. I want to thank you guys for coming through. Today, we're going to be reviewing a documentary from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Channel called Mississippi's War, Secession, and Slavery. I mean, a lot of people have to understand that Mississippi was like the New York and the California, economic wise, back then. And I'm telling you that there was a lot of things that was happening in the South that people just don't know about. And people, even though Mississippi ain't that big of a state right now when it comes to economics, but there was a lot of things that was going on running up to the actual Civil War, during the Civil War, and actually after the Civil War. And I don't think a lot of people know about this documentary. I mean, they actually shouldn't, because when you think of Mississippi, you think of everything that's good, we're 50. If everything that's bad, we're normally like number one or two. But you have to understand what laid the landscape for this actual place to go from an economic powerhouse to where we currently are at now, not even having clean drinking water in the actual South. And it's something that we actually have to fight people over. So we're going to have members of the Black Brain Trust up here, but without further ado, let's get right into the documentary.
Mississippi, of course, was a real storm center of opposition to abolition of slavery, to the election of Lincoln.
With the election of Abraham Lincoln, Southern states began to leave or secede from the Union.
A new confederacy was being formed. A second American Revolution loomed on the horizon.
With Lincoln's election, it meant that Lincoln had the power to appoint people to hold federal offices in places like Mississippi. And this terrified Southerners because they thought, my God, Lincoln might appoint an abolitionist.
White Southerners feared losing their money, losing their way of life. There is a sense that everything that you stand for could be lost.
We do not intend to carry on war
against the government while we live under it, but we do claim a right to sever all connection with you. Mississippi Congressman Otho R. Singleton,
1859.
This rush to leave the Union was not unanimous by any means, but whether they supported secession or not, they thought Mississippi had the right to do it if it wanted.
If you read what Mississippians said when they passed the ordinance of secession, it's clear that the only thing that created secession was the issue of slavery, the protection of the slave system.
Mississippi's War, Slavery, and Secession is made possible in part by the generous support of viewers like you. Thank you.
On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States of America. But in Mississippi, as throughout most of the South, cotton was king. King Cotton ruled Mississippi, and during its reign, Mississippi prospered.
It's important to recognize the sheer wealth that the South's economy had. By 1860, the South, not the United States, but the South had the fourth largest economy in the world. And that was largely due to its production of cotton.
Cotton in 1860 was the nation's most valuable export item, more valuable than steel, more valuable than manufactured goods. Cotton was the one thing that Americans made that the rest of the world wanted, and Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton producer. So it was a wealthy state.
It is literally a gold mine. Cotton seemed to flourish in the climate, and so it transformed the lives of many, particularly white men and their families. And so it became a very plantation-rich environment.
A plantation well stocked with hands is a ne plus ultra of every man's ambition who resides in the South. Young men who come to this country to make money soon catch the mania, and nothing less than a broad plantation waving with snow-white cotton balls can fill their mental vision. Mississippi author Joseph Holt Ingram.
People were addicted to cotton. Cotton was the crop that would bring you great wealth.
Particularly in the state of Mississippi, you have a state that enters the Union in the 19th century, in 1817. And by the start of the Civil War, it's the richest one in the country, in the entire Union. There are more millionaires per region than any other place in the United States. So Mississippi is a place where people know you can get land for cheap, but you can also participate in a market that allows your wealth to grow.
The majority of the wealth in Mississippi was controlled by a small group of people, the wealthy plantation owners, often called the planter elite.
The fortunes of this planter aristocracy were largely amassed by slave labor, slaves who worked the fields and grew the cotton. These rich plantation owners were dependent on slaves for their wealth and their power.
Throughout history, the powerful have dominated the meek. 100 years before the birth of the United States, wealthy British colonists purchased slaves to work on vast colonial plantations. But during the Revolutionary War, many American settlers, in their fight for freedom, grew less
mute up MOT if you can.
Was it double? What's going on?
No, you're speaking a lot. There's a lot of background noise.
And shortly
mute up a
after
little
the
bit.
American Revolution,
There ain't no background noise. I'm not even
the
moving.
United States
Oh,
banned the importation of slaves.
By the late 18th century, slavery was on the decline. But with the invention of the cotton gin, it changes everything. Cotton became king. And what happened was a transformation of this Western frontier. People are moving here in droves. Slaves are being moved from the upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, South Carolina, and they're being moved downward. And literally the complexion of Mississippi changes and becomes the blackest state of the Union.
By 1860, Mississippi's enslaved outnumbered its citizens who were free.
It varied geographically. In some parts of the state, piney woods in southeast Mississippi, the hill country of northeast Mississippi, there were very few slaves and slaveholders. In other counties, the counties of southwest Mississippi, in the Natchez district, the vast majority of people were slaveholders.
You have a state that has a huge population of enslaved people, and that's one of the enduring legacies, in fact, to this day, that Mississippi is the only state that has a Black population of almost 40%. This comes directly because of the popularity of cotton and also the success of this cotton crop.
Most of the slaves in Mississippi would have been employed on cotton plantations. Cotton was the engine that drove Mississippi's economy, and the most valuable employment for slaves was as field hands.
Most slaves toiled in the fields of big plantations in Mississippi, but slaves really worked everywhere. There were domestics, there were slaves that worked in industry and in factories.
They could be found building railroads, working on riverboats. There were slave artisans, craftsmen of all kinds. You could find slaves working almost everywhere in almost every industry in Mississippi in 1860.
They were mammies, and they were carriage drivers, they were the laborers. They sustained the Southern economy. They made fortunes for people.
It was like you've heard the expression of the Southern way of life. Well, it was only the way of life for some very wealthy people who owned a lot of slaves.
There were about 31,000 slaveholders in Mississippi in 1860. That was about 9% of the state's white population. The majority of people, some 55% of the people in Mississippi, were slaves.
Most of the wealth is concentrated by only a few in Mississippi. So most of the plantations are owned by a very small number of men. But there are still slaves in, I call them kind of out communities, smaller farms where you may have a family who owns 1 or 2 enslaved people.
If you count households and not individual slave owners, almost 1/3 of all Southern families owned slaves. In Mississippi, the percentage was about 49%.
And you know, it's really interesting because that complicates the kind of generalities that we know about slavery. If you only own 3 slaves, you might own a mother, a husband, and her child, right? And so someone's performing domestic labor. The child might be a playmate to the white child or children in the household. And so it really complicates things because all of a sudden you now see those households as microcosms of what can happen in the institution of slavery in the 19th century US.
The South was overwhelmingly Christian in nature. Their form of slavery was more of a softer nature type of slavery. The plantation owner, by and large, had to take care of the slave because they knew that the profitability for them was how well they took care of the slave. And that's not to say that they were well taken care of.
For me as a historian of slavery, when I read some of the accounts of the brutality, you know, it's enough to really take your breath away, that these people could endure for as long as they did.
Slavery was a very emotional issue. It had become so because of the agitation by anti-slavery people, which only made Southerners more defensive about the institution.
I think to question an owner about whether it was right or wrong would seem absolutely ludicrous to him. Everybody participated in some way or benefited in some way from the institution of slavery, and they always had.
Some slaveholders imagined that capturing and enslaving Africans was for their benefit, that they were exposing them to Christianity, that slavery was a school for civilization.
Some actually looked at it as it was their chance to be missionaries, even though they bought and were using these people.
Most folk who defended slavery were justifying it on the grounds of Christianity, and they pulled from the Protestant faith and also from the Catholic faith, using the Bible verse, "Slave, obey your masters." If you are obedient to your masters and your mistresses, there is a reward in heaven for the kind of work that you do.
From the 1830s onward, Southern politicians began to construct an argument that slavery truly was ordained by God and would give birth to the best of all possible societies.
Southerners didn't understand why they needed to justify something that had happened since time began. And the only kind of vociferous opposition that they faced would be from abolitionists.
Throughout the early part of the 19th century, the divisive issue of slavery would finally tear the nation asunder.
Abolitionism was a campaign to end slavery and set slaves free. It was a movement that began back in the 1600s when many religious groups condemned slavery as unchristian.
They were just a politically powerful small group of people. I think we have this idea that they were a kind of huge number of men and women who were dedicated to the abolition of slavery. And that wasn't the case at all. They were a really small group.
While there were a growing number of rationalist thinkers that criticized slavery for violating the rights of man, in the political arena of 1860, Southern Democrats endorsed slavery. The cotton-growing economy of their slave-owning constituents were dependent on it, especially in Mississippi.
The slave doesn't need the master needs the slave. And so slave owners believed the very opposite, that slaves needed them. A slave doesn't need a master, but a master has to, the only way he can be a master is to depend on a slave.
At the time, the majority of the Republican Party leaned the way of the abolitionist movement. And in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. As a result, his name did not appear on the ballots of 10 southern states, including Mississippi.
What this points to is the political power that a politician in a slaveholding state has. Lincoln did not appear on the ballot of Mississippi. In fact, did not receive a single vote from any southern state. And I think this points to the kind of political power that the plantation elite had. These were the men who were running southern states. You know, these were the senators, the governors, these were the mayors of large towns. These were the people who owned slave markets. And so not
Hey, MOT, I think you should mute up. You're kind of breathing over and making a lot of background noise on the chat. So, I mean, in the
Lincoln's nomination took place about 2 weeks before January. The intelligence came like a thunderbolt. Members from the South purchased long-range guns to take home with them. The unthinking among them rejoiced that the end was in sight, but those who considered more deeply were dismayed by the prospect. Mississippi Congressman Reuben Davis on the nomination of Abraham Lincoln.
In many ways, they made Lincoln out to be more of an abolitionist than he actually was. Lincoln and the Republicans campaigned on a platform that would have limited slavery's expansion into the Western territories. But Lincoln and the vast majority of his party had no desire to interfere with slavery where it already existed. But to many Southern politicians, he really did seem like a kind of boogeyman, I suppose.
Wealthy plantation owners feared that if Lincoln was elected president, that it was just a matter of time before he abolished slavery, and they didn't want that to happen.
Many fortunes were lost 3 years earlier during the first worldwide economic crisis, the financial panic of 1857. Wealthy Southerners were afraid that if Lincoln freed their enslaved, it would cause yet another financial disaster.
It would have decimated the economy. It would have decimated it. Mississippi was built on the backs of a cotton economy. It was built on the backs of thousands, tens of thousands of Black people who picked this, what they called white gold in the 19th century. It would have decimated it.
It would be an economic burden on the South to have to give up their slaves. But Lincoln offered to reimburse slave owners. You know, free the slaves, we'll pay you for the labor you've lost. But nobody was interested in that.
They're not necessarily interested in compromising with Lincoln at this point. It's a slap in the face to their way of life. They don't want to give up their slaves.
The die was cast. The die for secession was cast in Mississippi in the election for president in November of 1860.
Abraham Lincoln was elected the President of the United States, beating Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, and new Constitutional Union candidate John Bell. Lincoln won all the anti-slavery states of the North, as well as the western states of California and Oregon. No ballots were cast for him in 10 of the 15 southern slave states where his name did not appear.
Lincoln was elected by Northern voters. He did not even appear on the ballot in many Southern states. He didn't appear on the ballot in Mississippi. For many Southerners, this signaled a kind of sea change, that in the future, the North could elect a president without having the support of Southern voters. The South essentially had become a political minority in the country and was an increasingly weak minority.
The rights of states to govern themselves, threats to secede, and arguments justifying secession from the United States have been part of American politics almost from the very beginning.
In 1860, Jefferson Davis was Mississippi's long-standing senator in Washington. He believed that the states were sovereign and should be allowed to leave the Union if they chose. But he was also aware that the South was ill-prepared militarily, and so he argued against secession. He wrote,
I worked night and day for 12 years to prevent the war, but I could not. The North was mad and blind, would not let us govern ourselves. And so the war came.
The South was beginning to lose its power in the legislature, and they could see the writing on the wall. So by the time we get down to 1861, Mississippi opts to follow South Carolina out of the Union and to secede.
Wisdom dictates that all the questions arising out of the institution of slavery should be settled now and settled forever. Mississippian Jacob Thompson, U.S. Secretary of War.
When Lincoln was elected, John Pettus, a wealthy Kemper County planter, was Mississippi's governor.
He was part of a group of pro-slavery extremists known as fire eaters because it was said that they would rather eat fire than sit down with a Yankee abolitionist.
Governor John Pettus was a man who was very much in favor of secession. And thanks to his leadership and his charisma, his strength of character, he would help sway members of the legislature and among the civilian population to vote for an ordinance of secession.
As a governor, Pettus was in many ways pretty pathetic, that he was very opposed to staying in the Union under any circumstances. The fire eaters had sprung up in South Carolina. There were a lot of them later in Georgia. Pettus was probably the leading one in Mississippi.
Governor Pettus said from the beginning that if Lincoln were elected President of the United States, he would immediately call a secession convention and Mississippi would leave the Union. It was that clear cut. He was probably the most drastic secessionist that we had in the state. Really wanted to begin the war before secession. He did not want to compromise in any way that would permit Mississippi to stay in the Union as long as the North would not compromise on the issue of slavery.
Even before Lincoln was inaugurated, Pettus called for a secession convention and brought together delegates from every county in Mississippi, where they argued for or against secession.
Not all Mississippians were as gung-ho about secession as Governor Pettus and his fire eaters. You must remember, only a few Mississippians owned plantations. Not everyone grew cotton or owned slaves.
Those who have been long desirous for a pretext for secession now boldly advocated their sentiments and joyfully hailed the election of Mr. Lincoln as affording that pretext. The conservative men were filled with gloom. Secession they regarded as fraught with all the evils of Pandora's box, and that war, famine, pestilence, and moral and physical desolation would follow in its train. Mississippi Unionist Reverend John Hill Augie.
So this rush to leave the Union was not unanimous by any means. And two, you have to figure in the patriotism of Mississippians and other Southerners. They, after all, were products of the Revolutionary War, which had won them independence. The Union had grown out of that war, so they felt ties to the Union. Many of them had been educated in the North, especially the wealthier classes. So this was not an easy thing to convince people.
There were strong Union pockets in the state of Mississippi. For instance, when the Secession Convention was called to Jackson, several counties sent 2 delegations to represent. One side of the county would represent the secessionist movement, the other part of the county represented the anti-secessionists.
Tishomingo County, which at the time was a very large county, sent 4 pro-Union delegates to Governor Pettus's convention.
Their lives here were tied to railroad commerce, interstate commerce. There wasn't a lot to gain by separating from the Union. And they're sent down to that convention specifically for the fact that they're not ready to leave the Union yet. They want to wait and see what's going to happen. They voted against secession.
Those people lived in hilly country. They didn't have plantations. They didn't grow cotton. So they didn't have many slaves. There were very few in that area. Also, there was dissent in South Mississippi, central South Mississippi, because there were not concentrations of slaves down there. There were not plantations.
Jones County did not produce that much cotton. It had the smallest slave population of any county in Mississippi. When the Secession Convention came in 1860, Jones County elected a delegate who ran on a platform opposing secession.
Not every Mississippian was interested in secession. In fact, the ironic thing about Mississippi secession is that some of the larger slaveholders along the Mississippi River were opposed to secession because they worried about the impact that the loss of slavery would have if a war came and the war did not go the way they would have liked it to go. There are many who believe that the best way to preserve slavery was to stay in the Union and maintain control that way.
Vicksburg, ironically, Natchez, 2 areas that depended heavily on river traffic, were not anxious to secede because they knew what it was going to do to their businesses.
The 2 largest cities in the state of Mississippi voted against secession. But as the bulk of the rest of the state voted in favor, the pro-Union sentiment expressed here in Warren County and in Adams County would be stifled.
The real argument was not whether Mississippi would leave the Union. That much seems to have been certain. The question was, should Mississippi secede immediately, regardless of what other states did? Because remember, at this point, only South Carolina had seceded. So did Mississippi want to go out onto this very dangerous branch alone? Or did they want to wait for other states to secede?
But those arguing for secession would not wait and put a lot of pressure on those who were pro-Union.
When it became apparent that the rest of the counties wanted to secede, they had a second vote, and many delegates changed their vote to have a bold front Mississippi. Everybody is in agreement.
On January 9th, 1861, Mississippi's Secession Convention voted 84-15 to leave the Union.
The vote itself is a lot closer than most people believe today. There would be a lively debate in newspapers and town halls across the state of Mississippi. Not everyone was in favor of secession.
After the news broke that the Ordinance of Secession had passed, the Natchez Courier reported,
"The secession ordinance was received yesterday with almost unanimous disapproval and condemnation. Hasty, ill-judged, wrong were the terms generally applied to it. Our citizens generally felt that the convention had sacrificed everything and obtained nothing."
Days later, on January 21st, 1861, Mississippi's Senator Jefferson Davis resigned from the United States Senate, a day that he called
the saddest day of my life. It has been a conviction of pressing necessity. It has been a belief that we are to be deprived in the Union of the rights which our fathers bequeathed to us, which has brought Mississippi into her present position.
Pettus made Davis a major general of the Army of Mississippi. Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed the example set by South Carolina and Mississippi, and they too seceded from the Union. These 7 cotton-growing states came together and formed the Confederate States of America on February 4th, 1861. And on February 9th, they made Jefferson Davis the provisional president of the Confederate States of America.
Their whole argument for secession was that they felt that they were losing their freedom, their rights, the power to self-govern themselves. Many Mississippians, as well as other Southerners, felt that they had the right to secede and govern themselves any way they saw fit.
We're saying, well, they're trying to pick on us. They're going to invade us. They're going to, they're forcing us to do what they want us to do. People who lived in the South back in those days were, I don't know that that's ever completely gone away, but you ask me about something and I'll work with you. You tell me you're going to do something whether I like it or not, then you may get some resistance.
States' rights was a political theory that Southern states used to defend the institution of slavery. It was used to justify secession. But secession itself was driven by the desire to defend the institution of slavery. When Mississippi seceded in 1861, the delegates of the secession convention stated that our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world.
So the battle from the start was all about slavery. This business of states' rights, of course, among some latter-day historians has been injected, but it was really about slavery, and the secession resolution in Mississippi in January of 1861 says so in so many words that this is about slavery.
Mississippi's Ordinance of Secession.
Utter subjugation awaits us in the Union, if we should consent longer to remain in it. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. We must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers to secure this as well as every other species of property. For far less than this, our fathers separated from the crown of England.
In a way, it's ironic that the argument that they were making was that they were against enslavement, but not by an owner of a plantation, but enslavement by the laws and will of the United States of America.
Many Mississippians who desired the freedom to self-govern themselves denied that very freedom to over half the state's population. Liberty and freedom were foreign concepts for many enslaved. Born into a life of subjugation, they had never experienced freedom. The enslaved lived out their lives under constant constraints.
You have to ask just to be mobile. You can't choose your mate without your owner's permission. You're not free. If you're pulled away from the community that you know, and let's say you're sold 2 or 3 times, where are you going to run? You know what the consequences of running away are. You can't run away. The risks just weren't worth it. And so you would just hope. Many of them prayed for freedom.
The new provisional Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, issued a call for 100,000 men from the various states' militias to defend the newly formed Confederacy.
He began to remove U.S. government presence from within the Confederate boundaries. This called for Confederate troops to start taking possession of U.S. courts, custom houses, post offices, mints, basically all the federal buildings, most notably arsenals and forts.
After Confederate troops attacked and took control of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called up 75,000 Union troops to reoccupy U.S. properties throughout the South. Thus began the Civil War.
It is now near midnight, and the excitement is beginning to abate. The battle house and telegraph office have been thronged for hours, and speeches were made by many prominent Southerners. And in the distance, I hear revelry and shouts of applause for the gallant Beauregard in the Southern Confederacy. Unidentified member of the Vicksburg Artillery upon hearing of the firing on Fort Sumter.
We have to remember most of these soldiers were like teenagers going off to war. They thought this was a way to gain glory and honor and come back home and marry that pretty girl they'd always wanted to marry and want to be a hero. They never really stopped and thought about the blood and guts and being blown apart by cannonballs. That never crossed their mind until it was too late and they realized what they'd gotten into. And then it was a matter of pride. You don't go running home because everybody in town will know that you deserted and nobody will ever have anything to do with you anymore. And they were kind of caught up in the early part of the secession movement. And once it caught fire, it just kind of spread.
Our country calls, and he that would not respond deserves not the name of man. And though we fall battling for our rights and are determined to have them or die in the attempt. Private Robert A. Moore, 17th Mississippi Infantry.
Here in Mississippi, the Magnolia State would send her bravest and most noble sons to the conflict. Men of prominence such as Earl Van Dorn, William Barksdale, and Jefferson Davis would be quick to respond to the call of the state. Tens of thousands of these Mississippians would die on the fields of battle, reaching all the way from Pennsylvania to the Mississippi River and beyond.
Mississippi's brave sons marched into battle in faraway places, at Bull Run, at Port Royal, and off the coast of Norfolk. But as the war dragged on, the battlefields grew closer and closer home.
Shiloh, fought on April 6th and 7th of 1862, would be the bloodiest battle ever fought on the North American continent up to that date. The battlefield at Shiloh, just a few miles north of the state line with Mississippi, would be a bloodbath in which thousands upon thousands of soldiers north and south fell on the field of battle, including many Mississippians.
The brutal two-day battle produced over 23,000 casualties. A tragic irony, considering the name, for Shiloh means place of peace.
Union victory at Shiloh in April of 1862 would open up North Mississippi to Union invasion. And very shortly after the action at Shiloh, Union forces would move into the Magnolia State.
Mississippians feared the possibility, the threat of invasion from Northern forces, that this might encourage slaves to rebel. With slave owners gone, with their sons gone, with overseers gone, it left women, young men, old men in charge of the plantations, and they were afraid that these people would be unable to control the South's large slave population.
For Black people who are living on plantations and slave communities, masters and their sons are now away. And so there's a change in terms of the hierarchy on plantations, right? You now have to listen to plantation mistresses. Many enslaved people don't. They become insubordinate.
And many white Mississippians sensed in some way that they were sitting on a powder keg. Again, over half of the population was enslaved. How stable was that society? How would the slaves react to their masters leaving? How would they react to the arrival of Northern forces? And right from the beginning of the war, there were rumors of slave insurrections throughout the state, and those rumors became more frequent as the war progressed and as Northern forces actually began moving into Mississippi.
The invasion of Mississippi began in May of 1862, with the Union Army seizing control of the rail junction at Corinth.
In Corinth, you have the intersection of north-south and east-west rail lines. It was referred to at that point in time as perhaps the most strategic city in the Confederacy due to those rail connections. or with the fall of Corinth, the focus of military operations in the West will truly center on the fortress city of Vicksburg. And for the remainder of 1862 and into 1863, Union land and naval forces will operate against what was known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, the city of Vicksburg.
The big thing about Mississippi in the Civil War is that an awful lot of key events happened here that had an impact on the way the war was going to go and the way the war resulted.
Mississippi and Mississippians would experience war firsthand and see the horrors of war in their own homes. All the way from Ship Island on the Gulf Coast to Corinth in North Mississippi, Iuka and Meridian in the east to Vicksburg on the west, the entire state of Mississippi became a battleground, and scores of major engagements and minor actions were fought on the soil of Mississippi. By war's end, the state was pretty much left a desolate ruin.
Nobody in their right mind craves war. The wealthy Southern cotton growers didn't want war. They had hoped that the great desire for mighty King Cotton would prevent war. That didn't happen.
People are just afraid. There are just a number of things that are happening that's really decimating the communities that Southerners, both Black and white, are living through. In Mississippi, there's great death and sickness. People are hungry.
Despite the abundance of rich agricultural land in Mississippi, the state could not feed itself. It relied on imported food from the Midwest. So when the war began, Mississippi had to transition from a state that produced cotton to a state that could essentially sustain itself. And that was very, very difficult because in 1862, Mississippi was hit by a drought. So there was crop failures throughout the state.
I myself have seen in Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi hundreds and thousands of women and children fleeing from your armies and desperados, hungry and with bleeding feet. In Memphis, Vicksburg, and Mississippi, we fed thousands and thousands of the families of rebel soldiers left on our hands and whom we could not see starve. General William Tecumseh Sherman, United States Army.
There were real problems with food shortages. Now, those problems were made even worse by the military campaigns fought in Mississippi. The Gulf Coast fell very early in the war, which made salt difficult to obtain. Without salt, you couldn't preserve your beef or your pork. Grant's campaigns against Vicksburg, when his army marched through the Delta, they tore up many of the levees in the Delta, which made flooding more common and made that much of that land unsuitable for agriculture in the short term. So the military campaigns were tearing up the state's infrastructure, which added to things like drought and the absence of so many men from the home front. It was very, very difficult for the people of Mississippi to feed themselves.
A few farms managed to grow enough crops to get by. But other places, like the besieged city of Vicksburg, faced rampant starvation, and under those conditions, disease can spread rapidly.
Disease, or the amoeba, which was the great decimator of all the armies. That's where the great grim reaper of death really decimated the armies. These boys, they gathered together. They went off confident they were just going to meet a foe on the battlefield and blast away at each other, defeat the enemy, and be the heroes. Little did they realize, when all of these boys congregated from all of these different locales, that disease would decimate and kill. Roughly 80% of the boys in the war died of disease.
You have all kinds of illnesses that manifest themselves physically, but also emotionally, psychologically. You also have strikes that are happening. The Confederate currency doesn't mean much because of the rates of inflation.
Mississippi was suffering from rampant inflation. Money was quickly losing its value. There was a breakdown in local government. The state government had to flee Jackson.
When that began to happen, faith in government officials began to fade away. It became apparent that the government of Mississippi would be pretty impotent in trying to carry on the business of the state, especially after the invasion of Mississippi began.
Chaos reigned in some parts of Mississippi during the war. There was a breakdown in law and order. Counties were overrun with deserters, paroled prisoners, men who simply wanted to avoid conscription.
Mississippians went to war, a lot of them reluctantly. There would be pockets of resistance throughout, not just in Mississippi, but all across the South.
Not long after the Battle of Shiloh, on April 16, 1862, Jefferson Davis enacted the very first American military draft.
The draft was incredibly unpopular. To many Southerners, especially people who accepted the states' rights ideology or the states' rights doctrine, it seemed as if they had replaced one tyrannical national government with another.
Under the Conscription Act, all healthy free men between the ages of 18 and 35 had to sign up for a 3-year tour of duty. Unless you owned 20 or more slaves and could afford to hire a substitute to take your place. If you were wealthy enough, you could choose not to go.
For poor people, people who didn't own 20 slaves, it seemed as if they were fighting to protect somebody else's property, that they were being asked to bear a disproportionate burden. People understood what had caused the war, and now the people who had the most to gain from the war were exempting themselves from military service. They believed this made the war into a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
But once the war came along and then people started dying, and it really didn't matter who was shot down on the battlefield, whether it was a rich guy who owned slaves or a guy who came from a poor white family who owned no slaves, it was still Southern blood being spilled, and that was kind of a unifying factor, the war itself. But still, if you get back to cause, nobody can convince me that if slavery had not existed, that there would have been a war anyway. No, nobody can convince me of that.
Mississippi suffered devastating human losses during the Civil War. Approximately 78,000 Mississippians served in the military. Of that number, about 27,000 were killed or died. 1/4 of the white male population over the age of 15 in 1860 was dead. An entire generation was laid waste.
More than 620,000 American soldiers, North and South, died on the field of battle or from disease. It was the costliest war in terms of human life in American history.
On July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg, the great Gibraltar of the Confederacy, fell after a 47-day siege. Union forces took control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in half.
Vicksburg was really the turning point, not just in Mississippi, but of the Western theater of the Civil War, and I would argue even of the Civil War altogether. After Vicksburg surrendered, there were a lot of people in Mississippi who gave it up. They didn't want the war to go on. The loss of Vicksburg pretty much put the Union Army in control of Mississippi.
Confederate General-in-Chief Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April 6, 1865. 6 days later, Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. Today, Lincoln is considered one of the most beloved of all American presidents. But that wasn't the case during the Civil War. Lincoln was so hated during his presidency that he received well over 10,000 death threats.
As a governor, Pettus is very prominent in newspapers and wherever early in the war. But as time passes, he really becomes less relevant. He was just pro-Confederate, let's get the Yankees, kill the Yankees. But as the war began to come to Mississippi, there was not much he could do to stop it.
Pettus took the loyalty oath twice after the war, but he was convinced that he'd been singled out for a special punishment, maybe for execution. Was afraid he was going to be captured, so he fled to Arkansas, crossed the Mississippi River, and went into the swamps in the Arkansas Delta, and lived as a fugitive there. And he died, was buried in a cornfield there. The result is that John Pettus lies today somewhere in an unmarked grave, his grave as lost as the cause for which he so gallantly fought.
As the body of President Lincoln was being laid to rest in the Oak Ridge Cemetery of Springfield, Illinois, Confederate Lieutenant General Richard Taylor surrendered all remaining rebel forces in Mississippi to Major General Edward Canby. It was May 4th, 1865. The Civil War was at an end, but in many ways, Mississippi's true struggle was just beginning.
Reconstruction was an attempt to make sure that the former slaves, now free, would become part of Southern society, become part of American society. But as you know, there was all sorts of violence in Mississippi and other places in the South where individuals tried to keep blacks, not enslaved, because you couldn't enslave any longer, but keep them down, keep them suppressed.
White Southerners are angry about the loss of the Civil War. For those who lost property, their communities were decimated. They lost the lives of family members and loved ones within their community. Of course, there's animus. The richest state in the Union has now crumbled, right? Parts of it have been burned. And so I think quite naturally, there's a lot of anger. And Black people and Northerners, they're seen as the ones who are the creators of the downfall of their civilization.
Did slavery cause the Civil War? Yes, slavery did cause the war. Why people fought is an altogether different issue. Some of them did not own slaves. Many of them did not own slaves. Some did fight for slavery, to preserve slavery. Some didn't care one way or the other, but they did care about the Union Army coming down into their states. Union soldiers wanted to preserve the Union. They didn't care about slavery either. In fact, a lot of them were extremely angry when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1 of 1863. A lot of Union soldiers were furious.
The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln, was not a statute enacted by Congress. It was a presidential proclamation. Lincoln told his cabinet that he had used his powers as commander-in-chief to free the slaves in the Confederate States because it was a covenant that he had made with God.
The Emancipation Proclamation brings the institution of slavery to the forefront. There is no way that you can now state that the war doesn't deal with slavery, because the Emancipation Proclamation, in fact, makes slavery an issue. And it really changes the focus of the war.
Once slaves realized what this war was about, they rushed to Union arms.
Wherever there's a Union presence in the South during the Civil War, runaway slaves gravitate to that area, not only for protection of the Union forces, but the hope of freedom.
Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation due to the fact that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required the return of runaway slaves to their owners. But Union generals refused to do so and declared the runaways contraband of war.
You start seeing a large influx of runaway slaves. After the siege of Corinth, when the Union begins to occupy this area, runaway slaves begin to first drift in here singly in pairs and then large numbers.
In order to house the numerous runaways at Corinth, the Union troops set up a refugee or contraband camp.
In just a short period of time, Corinth Contraband Camp becomes a model camp throughout the country. This is the way all contraband camps should be.
Which is interesting, right? The state that becomes the richest state in the Union because of slavery also houses the largest contraband camp in Corinth, Mississippi. And so for the year and a half that it's in existence, it has upwards of about 6,000 people. It really becomes a model community. And I think at the core of it for Black people, to prove their humanity, to show that they can be more than slaves. People tend to think of those who were enslaved as living a one-dimensional life. Now, yes, it was oppressive, it was brutal, but I think what's really important, particularly in a state like Mississippi that had the largest population of people of African descent, you can see the cultural legacies that the state is left with, all the way from the culinary cuisine that enslaved people helped to create, to the music, but also the ways in which people worship. They built community in the worst and oppressive kinds of environments. And I think it's a real testament to their strength.
After the war between the states is over, Southerners, by and large, lost a lot of their lands to taxes.
During this time of Union occupation, you see a large influx of Northerners coming down. Later, they'll be called carpetbaggers, but these are folks that are looking to make a few bucks.
People were coming into Mississippi from other parts of the South and places in the North, but they were coming to try to take advantage of the cotton trade.
And realizing the potential, bought up a lot of these plantations and then created a new slavery for white and Black by low paying, okay, you're free to go, you can come and go, and you're free to go. You got to take care of your own medicine. You got to take care of your own food. You can live on the place. I provide a company store on the plantation. Now, the company store had all kind of beautiful little items and trinkets and jams and jellies and pies and all kind of stuff in there, which you could buy on credit. So the freedman, white and Black, who worked on those fields, got so in debt to the company store that he could not leave the plantation. So it was a new form of slavery that was more vile than the older form of slavery which existed. And of course, slavery in any form is no good.
I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
For more details about Mississippi and the Civil War, please visit our website at www.mpbonline.org.
All right, that is the actual documentary, Mississippi's War, from the Mississippi Public Broadcasting Channel. I can guarantee you, like, most people in my family never even watched that documentary. I had to, like, you need to watch this documentary because a lot of people just didn't know. Because what people don't understand is that even though that documentary was very factual, most of the people speaking in the actual documentary were PhDs in actual ex governors of Mississippi and senators and whatnot. County by county, how the Civil War is actually taught to people varies throughout Mississippi. People do not understand that. Like all this stuff with DEI and all that stuff that you see today, dude, they've been running that game for like since slavery down there. They routinely not taught history. Period. What's going on, to go?
Hey, what's going on, MOT? It's a wonderful documentary that was broken down. Actually debunks some of these fools running around here in the Manosphere and other places saying how the Civil War was about money and that's what it was about, and a railroad out to the west, and all this craziness these guys talk about. You even heard inside here in Mississippi where you had people where they wanted the railroads coming through as regulars. That was part of their commerce, part of how they moved their commerce. So they wanted it there. So they didn't.
They stopped the expansion of interstate highways through Mississippi through black areas for the same reason, and that still goes on today. And it's like
every day.
One 58-minute documentary from the state that pretty much led the Union debunks all that. So how do you spend all of your life avoiding the information and the history of what actually happened in the country that you claim you care about?
Because the name of the game is, and I heard it said by Edward R. Murrow, he said, the only new thing we learn is the history we don't know. It is definitely a move to see to it that you don't know what's going on by not knowing your history. Where you can have very foolish people come here, call themselves, teaching people and masterful of it and so forth, and other fools that come around and run this craziness on folks. And for those who are not knowledgeable, they'll actually buy into some of this idiocy. But when you start to really get into the facts and you start to break it down didactically, like this has been, you see just how ridiculous some of these actual statements are. And what you will find is that they're starting to really trying to take up literally the message of those of the lost cause.
That's what I'm saying. And it's like, how do you have a person pushing for cut the check? It's the same person that's pushing for non-political actual engagement in the process that's going to get you that check. Like, how does that work? How do you gain an entire audience of people who don't understand that this lack of participation thing is going to drive your so-called oppression?
Those of the mindset who were speaking cut the check are morons. They don't understand the process. They're sitting back here literally trying to promote you to actually become slaves. That's how foolish these people are. And that's how dangerous they are when they're running around here talking that. It's scary. Ignorance is a very frightening thing. And that's why we should always consistently fight against it, because how dangerous and how pernicious it truly is.
And again, these are not people who are white who are doing this. These are people who are black who's doing this, because a lot of people want to maintain this type of in the middle, nothing going to change prospect, so that way they can keep their platform. They want to run the gender war. They want to run the political misinformation, disinformation, disinterest campaign. They want to keep people in these areas, to keep people being low wage, no responsibility to skill up. It's everybody else's fault to like put in on them and do the things that they actually need. And that's what it is. It's crazy.
It's I mean, I have far stronger words for it, but
me too.
I'll not say it here.
Yeah. What's going on, Chris? Francis for the 2 hour super chat. Wait, this keyboard shitting. Okay, there we go. because there is no clear reason of not knowing this history, of not knowing that the people from that area are still running the same game that they've been running for a while. And it's like now the oppression was their fault. Keeping it going is kind of our fault through non-participation or not really skilling up or not voting or just a whole bunch of things that we should be doing, but we're not doing because we want to fight the gender war. We want to do that because we want to be entertained 24 hours a day. Like people have like they spend this time in this entertainment zone, where Charlemagne the God and all these kind of dumb ass motherfuckers occupy so much of your time, but when it comes time for you to do shit for yourself, you ain't got no time, no energy to do nothing. And every time you pull them out of that zone and put them in front of a particular information based economy, they fail all the time. And it's everybody else's fault but theirs. But then again, they want to troll the actual people who are working toward things, who live in areas that are overperforming, especially when you compare it to where those people are stuck at. Like, I don't understand how this is even a thing, because I know my grandfather and my grandparents passed down the information. We have to have our own libraries in Mississippi because most of the actual books that were actually written was not even allowed in the actual quote unquote library at the time. It still isn't, because they get to control the flow of information. Now, it's much different now because we have the internet, which I don't think anybody should be paying for, by the way. I think that the internet is pretty much, when you turn the TV on, you get your local news. I think the internet should be like that. It's something that should be paid for by the federal government at this point. We shouldn't be having private companies controlling the flow of information, stopping the flow of information through, the net neutrality stuff. It's just crazy. What's going on, Quizzer Prince?
How y'all doing, gentlemen?
I'm doing
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah, I mean, you beat me to the punch about the same stuff. Things been happening. I listened to the documentary. I believe I done seen that documentary before several years ago. But some that two major cities in Mississippi. That's how it is, and primarily down south. The major cities are dominated by the rural counties that good old Jim Bob won't like it was in 1950 and 60. They don't want to let no business come there, and they control stuff. And a lot of people in those areas just don't realize how some a handful of people like in Mississippi are stopping progress, stopping jobs,
Correct.
stopping opportunities, and that's about like the expansion out west. Everybody, yeah, y'all go ahead out there and fight all the Indians and do all that stuff. Here come the big business people come in, and I'm like, huh? Y'all, I mean,
Right after all the work's done. Immediately after all the work's done.
I mean, and y'all don't. I mean, I be picking at these guys I work with. We might be on the phone or something, and I be calling them out on that stuff. I mean, yep, yeah, you just go right ahead on and do all that work for me. You keep on fighting for paying no taxes. You out of all people, truck drivers should know. Once your wife is getting told going to the grocery store more than what it was, you're gonna feel the pinch. You're gonna feel the pressure. Oh my God! Okay. Keep right ahead on
Prince. Like, people are paying far more for groceries in small, rural, conservative areas than they are in liberal places. I tell people the difference in prices. It's like, especially like Missouri is an excellent state. I mean, you would think the same thing about the Alabamas and all that. No, dude. Like Missouri, we're talking about
you don't
South
have to.
Jacksonville, Missouri, which is not South, and it's definitely not Jacksonville, but it's a small place, and it's like the grocery stores around there are charging like $4 and $5 a pound for chicken breast, and I'm like, these people are clearly selling goods to create their own tax cuts.
I mean, the company I work for, we got a plant out there in Carthage, Missouri, and Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and I'm like, you go to
excellent
Cape.
place.
I mean, but outside of, I mean, you the services that you get I mean, you be like, y'all don't have nothing, and y'all really, really, really fighting for this. You know, that's the way y'all
I'm
want
telling
it.
you, man, they have a lot of like very fertile land in Missouri. Oh, Cape Girardeau, like you said, Carthage, that whole area, like when you go down the actual highway, as far as the eye can see, nothing but trees. I'm like, dude, they could have downed this stuff years ago and used all this land. I mean, you got the St. Joseph area where I'm starting to buy stuff at. I mean, like all this stuff, like Missouri has a lot of fertile land that no one is doing anything with. It's kind of like Mississippi or even Alabama for that state. That's what I'll say, Outcast. Yeah, it's crazy, and it's like, look, it's either you're going to learn this information or you're not going to learn.
Well, the name of the game is they want to keep people ignorant, because when you have this type of information, you really see what's going on. Then when you start to tack things on to what's happening today, you'll
It's the
actually
same stuff.
see you'll actually see that there's a continuum here, that this is not really far over, and that a lot of this stuff that's going on now was contingent upon what would happen then. This is really what's going on. This is what they don't want you thinking about. And that's why you have a lot of people also in this space who call themselves manosphere and are supposed to be down, don't want to deal with this information either, because they can't really process it, because they're not really prepared to do any work to
No.
counter some of this stuff that's out here. They're not prepared to do anything like that. So they feed you Twinkies of the mind. This ridiculous gender war and colorism with respect to black females, and a whole lot
Yeah.
of dumb shit that doesn't mean anything. And your game players and these straight sucker lades. And this is the crap that you get going on in this space. But stuff like this, they're not talking about it. And then when they do talk about it, it's erroneous. It's
Yes.
misinformation. And you have
Yes.
certain people's channels where they push this misinformation on quite a bit, as long as their own. And then when we call these people out, they get upset. They get angry.
Under the guise of universal acceptance of everybody's opinion, when you're actually in education and you know damn well that's not how education works. There's no universal acceptance of opinion.
And this is not about not just anybody's opinion can say anything. They're facts, okay, and then their opinions. When we want to talk about facts, let's talk about facts. But let's not make opinions facts. All right, especially when they're not based on such. And this is what's dangerous.
Good luck on that.
And we have to call, but we're going to call that out. And over here, we're going to deal with facts.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's much easier. The channel was built on another reason where I thought people wanted. No. They just wanted to hear the back and forth, and they didn't want to make any change. What's going on, May? Thanks for coming through.
Thank you, MOT. Nice to talk to you all today.
Yeah.
I just want to say I think that it's so good you showing history like this, like detailed, in-depth history, because for some reason, we Black folks are getting so distracted from what's going on. And the brother who was just speaking, he said there's a continuity. And I'm here today to testify that there is complete continuity between the slavery, and it hasn't ended. The Confederate States are still going strong. They're fighting at our state capitals in these southern states. They're embedded in our state capitals. They are our representatives. They're our local legislators. They are changing laws right now. And, it's really a resurgence of the Confederacy. If we really look at these new laws, they're all following each other and they're all doing the same stuff,
Very accurate.
I say let them have it. Look, I say let them have it. Let them have it. But California, New York, liberal areas of Texas, everybody should be heavily taxing these individuals for trying to maintain their third world countries in the actual southern part of the United States. I'm sorry. These states have to be put in receivership at some point if you cannot run an actual society. You give them 10 or 25 years to get their act together. And if they can't, you got to take them. You got to be like, look, we got to take control of this area because you're using our money to help you fund your actual nonsense. And there's a lot of people, unfortunately, with these liberal arts majors who aid and abet this foolishness. And it's like, when you have PhDs who keep saying that they don't pick a side in politics, or oh, I'm not gonna vote for anything matter. I'm like, hold on a second. You know how to do research. You know how to have your research challenged. You know how to do an actual response to the actual challenge, following specific directions. Why on earth are you not fighting for things to get better? Why are you so okay with things not being great, and then try to point the finger at white people or Latinos or immigrants or black women for not giving you a free position and letting you mutiny them out of their own position by large groups of dysfunctional people. So it's like, hold on a second here. At some point,
MOT, it's pure madness. And then when we look at these southern states, these confederacies, like May has mentioned, here these states are 35, close to 40% of their state budgets are being funded by New York, New Jersey, Colorado, California. These are welfare states. And here they are sitting here trying to turn back the laws on you around the rest of the nation because they are calling themselves conservatives. And what they're trying to do is turn back the clock on you by appointing these judges and so forth. And these ignorant Negroes are sitting back here saying, my strategy is to not to vote. I mean,
cut the check. We want reparations. Don't
cut
vote.
the check. We want reparations. No, give me intangibles. What?
It's almost like making coleslaw with like pure snakes. Like they're just sticking snakes. It's just grinding down the snake. Like, what are you doing? It's not part of the coleslaw process. What are you doing?
I mean, when you look at the reasoning behind this, it's madness. So we're going to call you people out. We're going to call this out and call you people out all day long, whether you like it or not. And of course, you're afraid to get up here with us. Of course you are. You will not survive us. You will not survive it. Not with the information that we're sitting here with. You'll not survive. So don't.
They do an excellent job at pretending things didn't happen. Man. So just let them keep
Fear
doing that.
getting up here. Fear getting up here. You should. But because at the end of the day, that kind of stuff is not going to work for all good. We have to talk facts here. We have to look at what is truly going on and look at the laws that they're passing.
Yeah.
Look at the laws.
They're doing it too. It's not even like they're planning. Yeah. They're doing it.
They're doing it. I mean, here you're talking about, I'm a B1. I'm separate. You're separate from any other black person? But yet these people are throwing you in the same bag as everybody else, where you're dividing, they're concentrating. Do you understand what that means? I mean, it's unbelievable, the thought process and the state of black politics that we have here in this country, and the collective thinking, and the pitiful amount of fools that are up here calling themselves the leaders that are here.
And
it's unacceptable. Go ahead.
I operate as an activist here in Atlanta, and I have been for the past 7 years. I'm known as the Confederate Hunter, and I have been battling the state, Governor Kemp, to be direct, because we have a state park that they are just fueling money into, and this state park is a Confederate park called Stone Mountain Park. Y'all may be familiar with it. It's the largest salute and honor to the Confederacy in the whole entire world.
Yeah, I went to Atlanta.
It is absolutely. You're familiar with it. It's very disrespectful. They have plantations there, slave cabins. It's basically a Six Flags to slavery. And they used to reenact slavery on that same little plantation. It's supposed to be an amusement park and a salute to slavery. And it's very, very disgusting. And it's literally in my backyard. And so I have had to, I thought it was going to be simple, And what happened to me was tragic because I didn't realize that the Confederacy was real. I have met Confederates. I have argued with Confederates. I have sat at tables with Confederates. These are real men. These are real white men. And I think a lot of people are thinking this is some gone time. It ended in the 1860s. No, it's not. No. They're like literally here, and they are fighting and funding. I challenge you all to do this. If you live in a southern state, go and check at your DMV and notice that you will find that the sons of the Confederate veterans or the Daughters of the Confederacy are fundraising through your state DMV license plates. Where do Black people
They're
have
the one
any
who's selling most
funding
of the
like
food
that? Where do we get funding
outside of
like
these
that?
places.
What's that?
Like they're the people who's selling the majority of the food outside these places. Like people
Yeah, the little cookies and the little cookies and yeah, I mean, and to piggyback on to that, you know, they you know, I've been to Chester, South Carolina, where they played they didn't stand for the national anthem. They stood all rows for the Dixie.
Wow.
That's how dedicated they are to it. I mean, a lot of people don't realize it, but it ain't nothing.
And I say
Okay.
that stuff is just fine. That is a free speech based issue. However, at the end of the day, if you don't participate in because the people who want to make stuff worse, they're participating every time they possibly can to meet out their mission. But the
They're
people who want to
lobbying.
benefit from the
They're
yeah,
lobbying.
oh yeah, but the people who can actually benefit from the actual process don't show up at all and expect everybody else to just do it for them. And I'm like, look, most of these people
Do the
who try to
most
pass these laws,
complaining.
yes, no participation, but do the most damn complaining.
Why
I
they
don't
doing
understand
this?
it.
Did you go to your county meeting, city meeting, when they planned
No,
this
no,
like
no.
3 or 4 years ago?
Quiz the Prince. Hey man, just catch me up, man. Hey man, just catch me up on what happened. Catch me up. I'm like, dude, the election was last week. Like, there's nothing to catch up.
Yeah.
You didn't
But
participate, you don't get nothing.
but
What's
they
going
up
on,
there.
man?
But they up with they up there with SBE and the gender war. They on that.
That's why I keep saying, man. Like,
Yeah.
there is nothing funny. There is nothing intellectual about this gender war type stuff. All it does is it keeps people fighting, no apparent reason. You have unhappy people who's trying to head pat and satisfy other unhappy people. I think it's crazy, but that's just
It's
me.
more than crazy. It's to me it's sadistic that you get that upset because look, you know how many women I get rejected by? Okay, move on. I mean, you think I'm gonna let that rattle at this point in my life rattle me or my finances about okay, they don't want to be bothered. I mean, they want to do their thing.
But
Okay,
these are
fine.
productive people who say that they don't want to take care of kids, wanting to hear about a woman that they don't qualify for. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all. But that's just me. Like the articles of secession, like the secession letters, those are real things. Those are real historic documents. You can look up, well, we weren't going to read it here, but no, hell no. You got to go do some goddamn work yourself. All right. Go look up each one of these states. South Carolina was the first, Tennessee was the last. There was 11 states in total. You could go read the articles of secession yourself. And once you look at the summary of it or the main idea of the paragraph, which is like taught in grade school, you'll see that these are the same things that are happening. And guess what? Most of these people who fought the Civil War, who actually died, are no different than the people who fight the gender war right now and stay and remain unhappy. They don't know what they're fighting for. They know a fight's happening, but they don't know what they're fighting for, why they're fighting, why they're out here being unproductive so that way they could qualify for individuals who don't care about them. Like I said, this stuff is not hard to get. This is the most unhappy people do the most complaining about everything.
Yeah, they do the most complaining, and they do the least amount of work. They do
Yes,
the
the
least amount of
least.
anything. They do nothing, but they sit back and they complain. They get angry, and then when you question, they want to sit back and try to curse you out. Especially if you're a younger person questioning them and so forth. This is the kind of garbage you see going on. This the trash you see going on. This is why I don't even try. This is why I try not to waste time with a lot of these guys because I know exactly what's going on with them. You are wasting.
They don't have a place in
wasting
society. Like, progress removes their place in society. And I'm
That's
like,
exactly
good.
correct.
Finally, yes. But what they want to do is they want to just come here in large numbers and support the wrong people and expect all the progress because they're doing so. And I'm like, look, if y'all want to do that, that's on y'all. Keep that stuff over there. At the end of the day, and here's how you handle political freeloaders. You just don't say shit to them. Because they're only issues. Okay, you don't make content for actual men, but you're concerned about black boys. Like it's such bullshit that you don't even have your own life together, but you care about boys from women that you're not trying to date or marry or fix their actual issues. Right after you just got through gender warring or searching Twitter and actual Facebook and TikTok for women to complain about that don't live in your area. It doesn't make any sense. Period. So
It,
just don't even bother with them. And it's like, look, like we don't expect whites to go actually out there and talk to their people on that Homestead Act land that they left them out on. Please don't expect us to talk to these dumbass motherfuckers caught up in this gender war and who actually want to be represented by entertainers. They're actually the same type of people. The difference is your people show up to vote to make shit worse. Our people don't show up to let shit get worse because they both have the same outcome. They want things to be artificially held back so that way they could just move forward from everybody. And if everybody just understood that, we can all be able to move forward.
yeah, well, you have in so many ways the wrong people are out front here, and in this manosphere. I get it. I understand there are a lot of people here who are just for entertainment, but don't come out here and say you're for something more. But yet you're out here, trying to block and trying to stop progress. I mean, let's be honest about that. A lot of these guys are not here. They do not want to see black men progress or black women. They don't want to see it. Let's just be honest about that. We're going to call that out. Call that out here. There are people out here that do not want to see brothers progress. They don't want to see you make more money. They don't want to see you get better educations. They don't want you to be more intelligent. They don't want that. All right. They want you to run with low end, effed up women that you shouldn't be anywhere around. Okay. And they certainly don't want to see you deeply involved in the political process, making changes for yourself and your own community. They don't want to see that as well. So we have these people here masquerading as God knows what, but let's just call that out. Let's call that out for what it is. All right.
Yeah.
Let's call it out for what it is.
Nagone, can I add something?
Go ahead.
They don't even the women they complain about, if one of them get too many of the women, they're gonna be mad at that one for getting all the women that they want.
Well,
That's all that is.
Hey, listen. My
no,
old
let's go to Mike
said,
V. Let's go to Mike V real quick. Mike V, what's going on, man?
Mike.
Hey, can you hear me?
Oh yeah.
Yes, I can. Very audible. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, what's going on, man? Thanks for having me on the panel. I thought that documentary was excellent. I don't know why this is not being promoted at this point in the political cycle that we're in. I think that that's a excellent grounding for where folks need to know how to move forward in the political process. And so I'd be interested in seeing, the guys who want to talk about vote blue no matter who, butt hurt, and all this other stuff. I like to see him debunk the documentary, debunk the history. Because
I'm actually going to be in Indianapolis tomorrow for the actual eclipse. Yeah, so I'll be there.
Well, it's going to be a half moon for some of these guys. So
yeah, of course, literally.
Yeah, man.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I don't understand why folks want to make up history on their own when we know we have access to this information. This, I mean, this is pretty much well documented and well presented. And I'm not sure why folks in the space want to rehash history and try to make it seem like it's something that it's not. Well, Democrats, were the ones who enslaved you. Well, yeah. I mean, the Brooklyn Dodgers used to play in New York. Now they're in LA. It's not the same franchise.
And the Baltimore Colts used to be in Baltimore. Now they're in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Come on, man.
Yeah, like let's have a real conversation about the factual information and let's go from there and not have all this conjecture that you see on these panels, like what I heard last night on this Coliseum. And so, nope, but I think that documentary was definitely necessary for today. I think that it's going to be a mile marker for what happens in November.
Correct.
Sure.
And you have to realize, Mike, that at the end of the day, they've never debunked anything. They just go out and just spread more myths and disinformation. Like that's their job. And what they want to do overall, they want to stop the completion of information across the board with everybody. Because once there's consensus, now there's time for action. Their job is to do everything else but have consensus. This is why they want to hide their actual conversations behind the most ignorant people available, because very ignorant ass people, they're not looking for consensus. They're looking for reasons to be stuck exactly where they are.
Yeah, because people like where things. If you are talking to a bunch of ignoramuses, and then you're keeping them ignorant, that's the state you're going to want to keep them in. That's the state you're going to want to keep them in, because then you can feel like you're in control, doing whatever, make whatever few shekels you're making over there, and you like things the way that they are. You actually like that status quo, and anybody who's there looking to change that is a problem. I mean, I understand it, I get it, but at the end of the day, that's not going to stop us from, without a doubt, looking at that, critiquing it, and taking a bazooka and firing it dead at you. That's
because black stagnation is a huge business. It's a huge business. A huge business among black people to stay incredibly ignorant about all issues. And you have to understand that. And don't think it's just black people. Do you have people who tune into the Fox News shit? They're desperately looking for a specific point of view that actually they can never live out. It isn't happening around them. And that's what it is. And it's like, look, as long as you know that's what it is, and you can just simply just get your own stuff together and stop waiting for this group progress type BS that they keep pushing. I'm telling you, if somebody is talking about group-based economics and their actual field is entertainment, they're full of shit. Okay? Let's talk about this universal togetherness and letting everybody get their stuff off. No, the only thing they're doing is repackaging progress behind people who are incapable of doing so, and trying to make it look like you care about those people's opinions when you actually are dependent on those people's opinion to actually make sure nothing works.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah, man. So I got to find an excellent one because I'm going to be doing this like every week. I'm going to take the next couple of weeks off. I got some traveling I need to do overseas for a project that I'm currently working on. But other than that, you got any last words, Quincy the Prince? Thanks for coming up.
No, I ain't got it, but I'ma just the handful of I'ma just keep pushing the progress and getting your shit together, piece on my end. I mean, ain't no need. That's about all. Handle what you supposed to handle, then you see everything else.
All right, man. Thanks for coming up as well. Any last words, Nagone 11?
Wonderful documentary. I've seen it before, and we watched that before, but excellent documentary. Anybody out there, debunk the stream. I encourage you to look to do that. And outside of that, MOT, thanks for inviting me up.
All right, Sage Outcast. We'll talk about Mississippi's War, Secession. The actual link is in the actual the link is actually in the stream itself. Like once you go to like the show notes, the actual link to the stream is there. It's Mississippi's War, my home state. I wanted to actually show people that Mississippi was a highly producing, highly starvation-based society, and they talked about how the plantation dynamics changed once they sent all their sons and older men off the war. And it's an excellent documentary. A lot of people need to understand that exclusively, because they was producing a lot of cotton and tobacco, but they were starving to death because they couldn't or wouldn't produce their own food. They had to have a lot of things imported to them because there was a pure profit-driven society, and then they sent off their sons and daughters of everybody else's to protect their gains. It was nuts. So, Mike, any last words before we get up out of here? Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, cool, man. All right, I want to thank you guys for coming through on the Man Tomorrow. You guys have a really nice rest of y'all night. Peace.